Good morning. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you, and I want to extend a special thank you to the Asian Marketing Task Force for inviting us here. I think it's a benefit. Basically, you've got some point people here from the UNSC Forum that came out here to Beijing to be able to speak with you and share with you in terms of giving you an update on what's going on with OCF. I want to thank David and Gary for making my job easier, because you spent a lot of detailed time discussing the resource models and the activity. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that as we get into the discussion. But I am going to cover basically the framework, which touches on the prior points that David and Gary brought up this morning. And then I want to give you an idea, what does the certification how is it made up, since one of my responsibilities is trying to take, as David just briefly touched on, making this all work, making sure that the devices interoperate with each other. And then I'll talk a little bit about the testing and what it is that we test. I'm probably going to spend a little more time in terms of schedules, because I think that's of interest to you if you're interested in certainly joining the OCF forum and making products, selling them so that you can make money, of course. And I'll touch on the labs themselves, what we have in work now and what we're looking at doing for 2017. And then I have a call to action for you guys out there. Okay, so I hope that will cover most of the stuff. At the same time, I'll certainly be here most of the day to answer questions, so don't feel that if you didn't get your question in within the allotted time that you will have an opportunity to speak with any one of us.
OK， 首先要介绍就是说那个 OCF 在测试上面的整体的架构，然后呢有一些测试的这个计划，那跟这个会告诉我们说怎么样做测试，以及是如何去做测试。那未来的这个 release 的 plan OCF 1.0跟 OIC 的 1.1 也会有做这些介绍。那还有就是已经通过审核的这些测试的这个实验室有哪一些？那在2016跟2017年的这个计划是什么？那另外特别提到就是说，如果大家有任何问题的话呢，就可以随时可以发问。
Okay. So the framework itself, when you look at what we test for, this is really a good illustration of the fact that, and David touched on this earlier when we were looking at the different models. When we look at OCF, there are a number of profiles. Some of these folks may refer these actually to tracks in terms of different segments in the market, whether we're talking about the consumer, the industrial, medical, or transport, et cetera. And you actually saw a listing today of 7 projects that have already been approved beyond the work that we're doing with OCF 1.0, and I would anticipate that we're going to see more now as the merger between the All-Seed Alliance and the OCF basically moves forward in terms of the different activities and the requirements and part of the specifications that we'll need to update, specifically with the introduction of OCF 1.0. But more specifically, what we look at is really this, what we call the middleware, this center layer. And if you recall, David touched on this earlier in terms of the models, in terms of specific use cases from which the different groups that he showed in his presentation all collaborate and cooperate in order to develop requirements.
OK， 这个架构刚才几个演讲者都有提到过哈。那最上层的 profile 这边是主要是在各个不同的 domain 这边的一些 profile。那其实整个的测试的部分会是着重在 framework 这一部分，所以所有跟测试相关的部分其实都是在中间这一块 framework 这个 resource model、data model、One IOTA 这些。Please.
So how does this all work? There's a lot of, as you can see, there's a lot of interactions that are going on here in regards to the certification program. But what happens actually is there's quite a bit of collaboration that goes on between the open source working group and the different work groups within the consortia. So David had touched on the security working group, the core framework group, and even the strategy working group that's involved with looking at the development of where we need to go next in regards to our roadmap. Anyway, all of these groups contribute, and we have to make sure at the same time, in order to test something that we consider mandatory, there has to be alignment between the open source working group in terms of IoTivity and the specifications that we develop in OCF.
OK， 那个整个 certification test program 哈是一个比较复杂的事情，所以必须协调各个 work group 之间来做这个很明确的一些规范。 这样子的话呢，才可以确保就是说它整个的这种 interoperability 的这个特性，就是 OCF 的要做的目标能够被达成。所以你可以看到这整个的这个图上有很多个 work group 他们彼此共同合作，就是为了 define 这个整个测试的这些东西。
So this alignment that you see here is extremely important in order for us to have a successful certification program when it talks about interoperability and also addressing the compliance aspect of the specifications. And then from that work, what happens in the certification working group is we work with a third-party vendor to develop what we call the compliance test tool. And that compliance test tool is what's being used in the certification test bed for the certification program in itself.
OK， 所以大家可以看到那个 Open Source Project Activity 这边跟 Spec 或者 OCF 这边所有的 work group 之间的这种协调呢工作是特别重要，这样才能够确保说整个的 interoperability 的这个特色。
So the test setup, some people think this is very complicated, and it isn't, because what it is specifically the compliance test tool, sometimes referred to as a test harness, is really software that we download into a laptop, and then that laptop becomes what we call the test control device. So it sends the inputs, commands, instructions, either if we're testing a device or a server. And the CTT itself in that software has an emulator that acts as a server when it's testing against a client, or it acts as a client when it's testing against the server.
OK， 这边的测试 tool 叫做 CTT， 那 CTT 可以 download 下来装在这个比如说你的那个手提电脑上面，然后发出一些控制指令出去，然后就可以开始做一些测试。所以这个最主要就在 CTT 这个地方，你可以看到，到时候你可以看到很多都跟 CTT 是相关的。
So one of the benefits of being a member of OCF is the fact that we provide this test tool across all of the members in the consortia. And what this does, it enables and allows the vendors themselves, the implementers, or let's say just developers themselves, to be able to use the test tool to test their implementation before they even introduce it into a certification test bed in one of the authorized test labs, or what we refer to as an ATL. Also, it allows them to prepare and get ready for a Plugfest, because we have 5 Plugfest venues a year, which I'll get into a little bit here. And then as far as, updates to the test tool itself, basically what happens is once we're working on an interim release, we share that with the IoTivity task group under the open source working group, and they in turn also run it against the test cases that we have to make sure that we have alignment before we introduce it as a release that is used for certification testing.
OK， 就是说加入 OCF 会员，然后呢，这个所有的会员都可以免费拿到这个 test tool。那在这整个的过程当中去做这个 certification 的工作，然后整个的测试呢，基本上来讲都是偏向 software 比较多了。
So what is it that we test? Basically, I touched on the fact of the middleware. Today, we look at these specific vertical resources, and we look at the framework that's been brought up before that we're responsible for testing. We do have some other projects in development where we're going to be looking at putting a program in place for the testing and the certification of what we call software development kits that you can basically take from one design and repurpose or use in another platform. We'll be looking at APIs and the plugins that David touched on before, now that we have all seen in OCF devices, and we want to make sure that they interoperate in an ecosystem.
那测试些什么东西，最主要的是在中间那个橘色这个层次，所以呢，主要是 software 的部分，包括那个 resource 的部分，还有就是架构部分，就是 COAP 啊、JSON 啊这些。那未来还会包括 SDK 的测试跟 API， 还有 plugin， 以及跟这个 all join 之间 compatibility 的这个测试。
The other thing that I'd like to point out here is you see these transport layers. This is not a mutually exclusive list. There's also BLE, there's Bluetooth, there's Zigbee, you'll probably see Z-Wave. So we don't test at the transport layer. What we're testing again is at this middle layer itself, and then of course these other programs that we'll be looking at.
OK， 关于比较底层的这个 transportation layer 这边 Z-Wave 这些是不在这个测试的范畴之内，测试的主要是 middleware 这一部分。
So this is the OIC 1.1 certification release. This is the latest testing capability that we've introduced in OCF. And as you can see here, you know, basically where we're at is we're now towards the back end here. So all the labs have now been officially open as of October the 3rd. All the labs have been audited by myself or one of the members of the certification leadership team. And as you can see over time, when we have the test tool available, we make it available to all the members. Initially, in the early onset of the program, we had to do quite a few releases before we had it in some sort of a beta version that would be suitable for the use of the members. The other comment that I'll note here is, you know, from David was asked a question about security. So in the OCF, you know, consortia under the security working group, you know, we do have test cases specifically addressing security as they're introduced by the security working group and handed off to us.
OK， 在那个10月3号的时候，整个 ATL 这边已经开放着做 P1 的 certification 测试。然后另外特别提到，就是在整个 security 这一部分，也会是在这边整个测试里面的一个重要的一个环节。在这边都有一些特殊的考量，以及有完整的这个测试的这个 test case for 这个 security 部分。
One of the other things about OIC 1.1 is, you know, as we're starting to see products come in for certification, this program will be in effect and stay out there for some period of time. I don't have an end-of-life plan for this at this point in time, but it will coexist as we move over to OCF 1.0. So you'll have multiple testing schemes out there available for the implementers.
OK， 现在是 OIC 1.1， 那 OIC 1.1的测试的话呢，有各种不同的方式，然后也有不同的这个 test case。
So this is just to give you an idea of some of the things that you'll see as they're being introduced with the introduction of going from OIC 1.1 over to OCF 1.0. And as David also touched on in his presentation, essentially, you know, OCF 1.0 specification is now basically bringing in the devices that have been previously certified under the All-Seen Alliance to be able to interoperate with those devices that we certified under OCF. And so you'll also see some capabilities such as versioning, endpoint, introspection with, you know, the other test requirements that are considered mandatory within the consortia. There's also, you know, with respect to security, you'll see some scalable architecture. You'll see the ability you should see the ability for devices, All-Seen Alliance devices that will have been tested under their latest version of the spec for Security 2.0 to be able to interoperate with the devices that we certify under OCF.
这一页主要是讲那个 OIC OCF 1.0在 certification 这一部分的架构，包括 Core Security 还有 Remote Access 这些东西。那基本上这些东西都有整个的包括进去。
Sorry that I'm blocking the screen. Trying to. Okay.
No way, no problem.
So one of my responsibilities as the chair of the CWG is trying to make sure that we have alignment between ourselves and IoTivity, the IoTivity specification coming out of the open source working group. This is just basically a schedule to give you an idea of what we're seeing over time, where you see this OCF spec 1.0 that's coming out here in the late part of 2016. What that implies is it's not the final spec, published spec. It is a pre-release of the spec that we will use to start testing with in PlugFest going out possibly this December 5th through the 9th, and then for the subsequent PlugFests that take place in 2014. But the main point that I'm just trying to drive here is we're tracking this, and we exchange quite a bit of information with the IoTivity task group and in the open source working group.
OK， 这个是一个过去一些 activity 的活动哈，从12月10号一直到这个2016年最近这一部分 PlugFest 的这个 Number 10是在12月5号到9号。
This is the current OCF 1.0 schedule. Typically what we do is we do host 5 PlugFests a year. Our experience has shown, and this is very common with other consortia, whether you talk about Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, etc., This is subject to change. I know you're taking photos of it, but it is subject to change, just to make you aware of that. But what this shows, and it lays out over time, the dates that we have for the Plugfest are all locked in. We use our labs. We encourage the labs to be involved in the program, getting ready for certification, because this allows us to have the OCEs. These are basically OCF certification experts, the lead or senior test engineers at those labs that'll be responsible for managing the OCF testing program at their particular site. So we use the labs basically to provide logistics support for the Plugfest. And then, you know, we have the different vendors that'll show up, and it's usually 5 days of testing. There may be an opportunity where if we have the latest available version of the test tool, we make that test tool available to the participants before they show up, so that we try to maximize as much testing. And what this shows is, you know, providing that the specification, the pre-release specification that I touched on, is available for use in December. We'll start testing with it in December, and then typically about 3 or 4 Plugfests, things should be pretty cleaned up in terms of the specification. So this light blue section here represents what we call the landing zone. Somewhere in there is when we anticipate we're going to have devices that are very clean and basically ready and will meet the requirements in order to be certified for OCF 1.0.
OK， 这些是 Plugfest 的 event 啊。那这些在 Plugfest 里头的话呢，其实是一个，就是说对于这些 spec 的一个先前的验证，在这里面可以做很多大家都可以在一块，然后去针对这个测 CTT 这些 tool 呢，大家共同讨论，然后做一些测试。这不是一个真正的这个 certification 的一个结果，是提供一个平台，让大家在那边可以针对这个些 CTT tool 测试完之后，有些结果可以互相讨论。Please.
So I know this is an area of interest to everybody here, since there isn't physically a lab in China, but I want to assure you that the labs that we have today, some of them already have test beds here in China. Okay, and it's really a matter of how soon we need to light those labs up if we go that route. Or there are also potentially other options, since we do have other labs that are in the queue. The initial 7 labs that we have today is based on the forecast that we had, you know, collected from the consortia. So there's plenty of capacity out there today to address anything that's in the pipeline. Our plans in the CWG is in the latter half of 2017 is to relook at the lab that we have globally and see, you know, whether we need to maybe put 1 or 2 labs here in China. Since I've done this before in other consortia, and I'm very familiar with quite a few of the labs here in mainland China, I'm very interested in that. I'm certainly open if you have any inputs or requirements, please share them with Richard and also with myself, so that I can take that back to the certification working group, because we'll be meeting next week face-to-face in Taipei. As I noted, the labs are pretty scalable that we have today and can certainly open up test beds here very quickly. And the other thing is that one of the requirements that we do have is once we agree to bring up a lab, then the lab has got to identify what we call an OCF certification expert, and then that individual gets pulled into these other Plugfests that I talked about, where they need to attend those Plugfests, so they can start getting familiar with the test, not just the test tool, but reading the test logs and the traces, because they get pulled into providing what we would call third-party attestation in terms of seeing whether or not the different implementations are ready to go for certification. I know I covered a lot, so I'm going to stop and then I'll pick up.
OK.
This is I'm from New York, and we tend to speak very fast.
OK.
So one of the things that we have within OCF is we have a ATL authorized test lab set of requirements. And essentially what that requires is not just identifying a OCF certification expert, but it requires that we also audit the lab. So usually myself and another individual will go out there and audit the lab, and we require the OCE expert to be familiar with what we call our certification requirements document.
OK. Excuse me, what is OCE?
OCE stands for OCF certification
Expert.
expert. Yes.
OK，所以那个 ATL 这边不只是要能够这个，就是说被验证在整个 OCF 规格这个相同上面，同时呢也要有这个受过专业训练的这个专家啊来做这个认证。
So a little bit about the program itself. It is a logo program. Someone asked David the question earlier, well, how do you know that the device is certified? Well, you don't get a logo unless you get certified. So essentially what happens is when someone brings in a product to the lab and it runs through all the tests, the OCE submits the report to what we call a certification body. That is an independent body in OCF that looks at the logs and the traces and confirms, yes, that product has met all the requirements. At that point in time, that vendor that submitted the product for certification is granted what we call a certification certificate. We post it up on the website, and we give them the right or the authorization to use the OCF logo.
OK， 通过这个测试之后呢，就会有一个这个 OCF logo 啊，在这边一个 program， 然后 OK。
So the things that we're working on in regards to certification for this coming year is obviously we want to automate the test tool. So we're in the process of doing that. And that test tool will also support UPnP. And I would assume at some point in time we'll be able to do the same thing with the stuff from the All-Seed Alliance. Since we're just going through that, the transfer of assets and reviewing what they have that we're going to be reusing. We also are going to be introducing the introduction of bridging functionality, and David touched on the idea of the bridge, okay, in his earlier presentation, to allow the interoperability between OCF certified devices as well as the all-GEN or the all-SEEN authorized devices. So you'll see bridging and you'll see the introduction of plugins. And this is what we would call certifying alternative implementations. And then finally, you know, is to ensure that we have a good convergence with the all-SEEN devices. And as David and Gary touched on earlier, you know, you're going to see eventually this stuff merge and it'll be something sort of an OCF flavored certified a series of devices over time. So let me leave you with one slide here. One more slide. So in summary, what I hope that you take away from the folks that are here today, giving you an update on OCF is, if you're not a member, you need to join. You need to come on board with us. I think it's pretty exciting with what we have to offer, what we're going to be able to do with the ecosystem in terms of interoperability, and then take time out to review our latest specifications, the OIC 1.1, and as the OCF 1.0 specification is released. Also, you know, it was touched on, you know, you got to have stuff from the open source work group that's contributed by volunteer members, because that's where we extract stuff from that we align within our own specifications that we ultimately will get a chance, an opportunity to test and to bring into the testing program. So take this opportunity to network with us as far as questions that you may have. And once you join, you know, bring your devices to the Plug Fest. We have 5 of them a year. I look forward to seeing you at one of those venues. Get your product certified so you can use the logo and obviously make some money. The URL here that you have will certainly get you access to a lot more information, and I just again want to thank you. I know we're a little pressed for time, but again, I'll be here for the rest of the afternoon to address any other questions. Yes? Thank you.